The way the dead were treated at Little Bighorn, where General Custer made his last stand against the combined Lakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne warrior forces, reveals a lot about how people at the time felt about life, death, and the respect given to those who were killed on the battlefield. Left to the weather and susceptible to both natural and human forces, the dead tell the horrific story of the most infamous of the many American Indian conflicts. 1876, Bighorn County, Montana. There is still animosity between the new Americans and the native tribes despite 2 centuries of expansion, colonialism, and conflict. In particular, the Plains Indians constituted a major barrier to American progress. The Plains Indians in particular posed a serious threat to American expansion. The Apache, Comanche, Cheyenne, and other tribes who comprised the Plains Indians were renowned for their skill as warriors and were especially feared for their unmatched horsemanship. They were able to seriously harm both the untrained settlers who had migrated onto their land and the professional, well-trained American soldiers, even though they were usually rather small war bands armed with bows, tomahawks, and a few other weapons. Because these tribes were fierce, unyielding, and always ready to fight, they posed a serious threat to American authority in the areas where they lived. In 1851, the Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed. Its primary goals between 118 and 544 were to prevent intertribal conflicts and safeguard American interests in white settlers, because in addition to putting white settlers in danger, these conflicts also hampered trade and resulted in unwelcome and costly intervention by American military and government forces. The pact clearly delineated the borders of 8 indigenous groups in their territory to thwart any attempts at territorial expansion. In addition to permitting the building of roads and fortifications and ensuring that passengers could safely utilize the Oregon Trail, the region was acknowledged as autonomous tribe territory that had not yet been claimed by the U.S. A few years later, conflict resurfaced. Former adversaries had remained rivals, and their infringing on each other's land in search of buffalo exacerbated the situation when massive amounts of gold were discovered on Indian lands. In defiance of the previously signed agreement, those who wanted to make their fortune traveled to the area and began moving there, and American officials did little to stop these abuses. This simply served to heighten the discontent among all parties, and in 1866, the United States was eventually forced to act. During the 2 years of the Red Cloud's War, 200 American soldiers and civilians were killed, along with an unknown number of Indians. After 2 years of combat, the Second Treaty of Fort Laramie was signed, bringing the conflict to a close. However, akin to the first treaty, it was swiftly violated once more by the advancing white gold miners, who were legally barred from entering the territory. The Army took some measures to stop this because of the sheer quantity of settlers, but they were mostly unsuccessful. When unmet promises failed to stop the influx of immigrants hoping to take advantage of the region's lumber and gold wealth, the U.S. government started to convince the Lakota to cede their rights to the resource-rich Black Hills. Pressure to give up the Lakota's rights to the resource-rich Black Hills. According to one colonel, it was the only aspect they appreciated. Resentment existed for years. The Americans made continual demands on the Lakota to give up their land. They aggressively attacked the villagers because they intended to use some of the last remaining productive buffalo hunting areas to build a Northern Pacific Railroad. 2 well-known Lakota native war commanders supported armed resistance at the expense of Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse. After learning that the Americans would only give them unmet promises, many Sioux and Cheyenne tribes who had previously been reluctant to fight embraced the 2 men. When Custer and his men were sent out as scouts from the Maine Expeditionary Force on June 22, 1876, they found a native camp around 14 miles east of the Little Bighorn River by the early hours of the 25th. The next day, Custer's scouts had planned a surprise attack before hearing that an opposing war band had discovered their route. Before the enemy army could cover the distance, the decision was made to strike immediately. Custer split his 700 troops into 3 sections at Little Bighorn. One commanded by Custer would attack from the north, another would stop the natives from escaping from the south, and a third would charge the village directly. Custer and his troops began the attack around midday after riding into the Little Bighorn Valley. While Chief Sitting Bull and his men made sure the ladies and children were safe, Crazy Horse faced Custer head-on. No more than 800 combatants were present at the campground, according to U.S. intelligence. In reality, there were 2,000 combatants, many of whom were better equipped than the Americans. Because Custer and his 210 men were utilizing rapid repeating rifles rather than the American single-shot Springfields, they were immediately encircled and shut off from their allies. After the combat, which lasted just over an hour, finished with the defense of what is now known as Last Stand Hill, Custer and his men were totally devastated. No individual survived to describe the real events of Custer's last stand, hence the details of the combat are unclear. Native American war stories passed down orally over the centuries can occasionally be inconsistent and unreliable. Several days later, Custer, a native Crow scout by the name of Ashishisha, gave a vague description of the battle, saying that Custer had directly attacked the village but had been quickly driven back to Last Stand Hill, where he and his soldiers eventually perished. Custer's defeat was not communicated to the two other squads sent to attack the settlement until 2 days later. They rushed to find them after learning the startling news. The native warriors had already departed, with most of their dead already gone. The only American casualties remaining on the battlefield were 210. The men tried their hardest, but they were unable to reconstruct what had happened on the battlefield. Captain Frederick Benton, the captain of the 3rd Group, came to the conclusion that the scene was a panic and a rout till the last guy was killed between 544 and 632. The men most likely allowed their horses to run wild without being instructed to do so, in my opinion. Few people complied with the numerous instructions that were given. Most likely, they were in a panic. As mentioned earlier, it was a rout. Along with being severely damaged, the American remains had lost most of their clothing and any useful possessions like guns and knives. The soldiers' trigger fingers were removed to keep them from fighting in the hereafter, since they felt that one carries their body with them. Custer refused to listen, so knitting needles were inserted into his ears, and an arrow was placed into his genitalia to stop him from procreating. Shortly after the campaign began, the dead were hastily buried in shallow graves. 632-709. Due to the men's lack of digging tools, many of the fallen soldiers' graves were just a few shovelfuls of dirt heaped on top of one another. The most distinctive was Custer's burial, which was marked with stakes buried 18 inches deep. A piece of paper with his name on it was placed inside the stake, along with a case of used cartridges. Custer's death was reportedly caused by a gunshot wound to the heart. He had been shot in the head, but it had not bled. Thus, it was probably done after he died, the final place to rest. Over the next year, the populace made repeated demands to return to the battlefield, recover the dead, and bury them with honor. 709 to 748. I wrote to inquire whether the Secretary of War would approve the required expenditure, since the wives and relatives of the officers who were killed with Custer are urging me to send in their bodies. Lieutenant General to General Sherman, Sheridan wrote. The Adjutant General's office may have sufficient incidental funds or other funds under the Secretary's jurisdiction that could be used for this. There won't be much required. After their plea was turned down, Sheridan and Sherman continued to urge the military authorities until they were granted permission. Soldiers arrived at the battlefield on July 2nd, made camp, and began their arduous assignment. The area was littered in decaying carcasses that had been eaten by wild animals and predators when the men arrived. 748 to 846. Until they were certain that everyone had been located, sticks were first used to mark the last resting places of the deceased. Following the officers' identification, their corpses were collected and put in coffins that were prepared for re-interment at a nearby army fort. The recruited men, however, would never leave their final resting places. Their bodies were left in place because there were too many of them to escape. Stakes were used to mark them, and they were buried in more suitable graves. Sheridan and his soldiers departed the region with the assurance that his mission was completed and that every man had been buried with honor. But as the Montana rainy season drew near, the loose, dusty ground was swiftly carried away by downpours, returning the bones to the elements and potential predators. John Foose shot a photo shortly after the rain began, showing the bone-covered terrain once more. A brief victory. The Lakota and Cheyenne tribes did not truly win the war, despite their brief but spectacular success. 847-915. The American people and government came together in support of Custer and his troops, who will always be remembered as brave and gallant warriors. Because Custer had been a famous Civil War hero, and the country desired to exact retribution for his murder, a huge, overwhelming army of American soldiers was sent in to smash their adversaries and put an end to any further rebellion. Most Native American warriors surrendered within a year after American forces seized their territory and hunting grounds because they were unwilling to continue fighting. 915 to 932. Despite the fact that hundreds of men had lost their lives for the Black Hills, the United States seized them without providing any recompense. The area created vast amounts of money and was swamped by gold miners. It was common for treasure coaches to convey wagon loads of gold worth $300,000 or more.